This episode is brought to you by Bumble. So, you want to find someone you're compatible with, specifically someone who's ready for a serious connection, totally open to having kids in the future, is a tall, rock-climbing Libra, and loves rom-coms with vegan pizzas on Tuesdays just as much as you do. Bumble knows that you know exactly what's right for you. So whatever it is you're looking for, Bumble's features can help you find it. Date now on Bumble.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Get in, loser! Mean Girls is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Join Katie Heron as she meets the plastics in Tina Fey's new twist on the modern classic. Get ready for more of the rumors, backstabbing, and jokes you loved from the original movie with some fetch surprises. Rated PG-13. Wear pink and head to ParamountPlus.com to try it free.
The definition of trust is a firm belief in the reliability, ability, and strength of someone or something. Some examples: relations have to be built on trust. They have been able to win the trust of the others. Today we're going to be talking about trust. Trust in our relationship is so crucial and important. It really does build a firm foundation. Now, everything that we do is essentially built off of a foundation, and it's off of the foundation of trust, or it ultimately leads to trust. So this is one of those episodes. I do encourage wives to listen in because trust is so important, and it's going to lead to discussion that hopefully builds your marriage and ultimately the trust, so that way you can be successful. So if you're ready to go, stay tuned. So welcome back to another episode of the Husband Coach's Corner. Today we are talking all about trust. Now, like I mentioned before, this is one of those episodes that you want to have your wife listen to. Either you listen to it together or you listen to it separately. It doesn't matter. The point here is when you guys talk about trust, you want to make sure that you and your wife are on the same sheet of music. If you are thinking trust is one thing and she's thinking another thing, you guys are going to be going in the wrong direction, and that's ultimately going to hinder your relationship and the foundation and really hurt your ability to have trust, which is a crucial part of being successful in marriage. So I don't want anyone to feel like they're left out on this or that they're missing this or whatever, because it really is that important. Now, today's episode, I'm only going to kind of glance over some things, and I'm not going to go really deep. If you are looking to go deeper, and this community is for husbands only, but I do have the Patreon account. Hopefully by the time that you're listening to this episode, which I have scheduled to release on March 17th of 2024, then the Patreon account will be up and running. So you can go deeper into some of the strategies that we as husbands can use to really build trust in our relationship and be able to talk to other husbands in that community to see what they're struggling with. That's the goal of the Patreon account. Check the show notes of this video. Hopefully, like I said, I have that launched and you guys can go in there and really start to unpack how you can become more successful in your marriage. Now, last thing that I ask for pretty much every episode is whatever you're listening to this podcast episode on, interact with it, either through a rate, a comment, a subscribe, whatever it may be. Interact with the comment, interact with the podcast. But more importantly, if you find this podcast helpful for someone, share it with them, because there's nothing greater to helping this podcast grow in the community and helping others than to share something that you think would bring value to them, because that's my ultimate goal. Let's dive into the content about trust. How does trust lead to success in marriage? Now, to build marriage and become successful in it, you have to build trust between you and your wife. That should go without saying. So I didn't say anything earth-shattering, hopefully. But if you didn't know, you got to build trust between you and your wife. As husbands, right? I'm talking to just the husbands for a second. As husbands, it's important to lead this charge as best as we possibly can. Our wives, they require us to lead them, and they need us to lead them in a way that builds and fosters a trusted environment, or an environment full of trust and confidence, right? So it's important that we lead in this. We can't sit back and say, oh, well, she should just trust me. We have to do things, and we'll get to that, but we have to do things that foster an environment of trust, right? Everything that I teach on this podcast is all about how you and I, as husbands, can help our wives learn to trust in us, but ultimately their strategy is to set an environment so that way we can be successful. And that's the whole premise behind the success podcast. Now, I do have notes, so I want to stay to it because I could go in so many different directions when it comes to trust. You have to know your wife and lead her how she responds to be led in the same season, to be led in the season you are in at that time. All right. So going back to that whole, everything we do here is about environment and setting that and giving you the strategies to be successful. You got to know what season of life you are in. And when you know what season of life you're in, then you can start to perform things and build the trust that you need, at least in the lens of what today's episode is. When you understand the season, you can start doing things and lead your wife in a way that builds that trust for the season. Here's some key things to look out for when you are building trust. Number one, you got to build emotional safety. Number two, communication breakdowns. Number three, building and rebuilding trust. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later. Number four, intimacy impacts. How are you impacting your overall intimacy? And I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking about the ability for your wife to come to you with problems, the ability for you to go to your wife with problems, right? So for all of my wives that are listening to this episode, it is extremely important that you are fostering environments that your husband doesn't have to be defensive. If you are constantly attacking him, guess what? He's not going to trust you to come tell you the things that are really on his mind, on his heart, the things that are bothering him. And that's going to ultimately hinder his ability to lead in the relationship to foster an environment of trust for you. So now both of you want trust, but neither of you have the ability to serve the other in that capacity because you're constantly going back and forth. Yes, husbands, we need to lead in this area. However, our wives need to also participate. All right. This isn't a spectator sport. We are in a marriage together. We are in a covenant with one another. And that is so important for us to realize that we work together. All right. So number four, intimacy impact. Number five, vulnerability. Just so everyone understands, let me explain vulnerability because when we talk about the impacts to intimacy, I did kind of talk about being vulnerable, being able to go talk to your wife. But here's the deal. Let your guard down and set an environment for your wife to do the same. Here's the difference between intimacy impacts and vulnerability. You should be okay with going out and doing silly things if it's something that's embarrassing, but it brings joy to your spouse. I don't dance. My wife knows this. For the first time in a very, very long time, honestly, since our prom, I took her dancing and I felt like a fool because it's something that brings her joy. I was able to find joy. Now, I was vulnerable because there were other people there and I don't dance. All right. The irony is I'm a musician that has no rhythm except for when I'm playing the piano or the drums. But I can't move my body in rhythm to a song. It's ridiculous. I know. It's my shame to bear. All right. That level of vulnerability, it builds to that intimacy environment. And I'll say that number 4 and 5 kind of go hand in hand, right? But I just wanted to clarify, like being vulnerable isn't just discussions or being able to tell your wife something. It's actually the actions of what you do, which then leads to the intimacy, which is more of that discussion. And it's the intangible aspect of our relationship that we constantly need to check in on because we get lost in intimacy. And Hollywood tells us something different about that and whatever that even looks like. I'm here to tell you intimacy is a very, very important aspect of building trust. And if you don't check in on it, you will likely not build the trust. Number 6, betrayal. We got to be on the lookout for betrayal. This is the arch nemesis of trust. There is anything that you and I could do to destroy trust, it is to betray our wife. And for a wife, anything that you could do to destroy trust is to betray your husband, because the way that we do it is usually in the way that cuts the deepest to our spouse, and it tears down walls in ways that repairing is extremely difficult, and in some cases almost impossible to imagine rebuilding. Not that it can't be rebuilt, but because you don't have any hope that it would be rebuilt, then that trust is always going to be wavered upon or teetered upon or destroyed or deteriorated, whatever you want to call it. Number 7, and we're going to talk about betrayal, by the way. We're going to talk about that. Number 7, conflict resolution. All right. That's pretty self-explanatory. Conflict resolution is what is going to be the catalyst, if you will, to building trust. Because if you can solve your conflicts well, then you're going to have confidence in your spouse that you guys are going to make it through on some things. So conflict resolution, I think that that's a no-brainer, self-explanatory. And then number 8, shared values and goals. Now, number 8 is kind of one of those things that if you don't have a shared value or a goal with your wife, or if you're a wife listening to this with your husband, then what direction are you guys going in? This really comes down to that foundation. You got to have a direction that you're going in your relationship. So hashtag marriage goals. That's what you want to get to. You want to get to hashtag marriage goals, things that you guys want to see thrive in your marriage. Now, these 8 areas, they all play a part in building trust in your relationship, but we only have time today to discuss the 3 that I talked about, which are betrayal, building trust, and then we're going to talk about shared values and goals. All of the areas are important to building trust. What things destroy trust in our marriage? I almost didn't leave this segment in. I was going to take it out because it's like, how do you not know what destroys trust in your marriage? We all know what destroys trust in our marriage. But the truth is, if we don't name it, then we're not going to be able to identify it. And the purpose of this podcast, the reason it exists, is to make husbands and, in this case, wives more self-aware of the things that we really need to discuss and unpack in our relationships. All right. So the first one is going to be betrayal. We're going to talk about that and unpack that. Again, this is a overview essentially, but we're going to go fairly deep into this one because, like I said, it's the arch nemesis of trust. And if we don't understand our problems, we can't develop a solution. That goes back to the problem solving podcast that I did in the past. Go check that out. So here we go. Many of you. All right. So now the obvious one in betrayal is having an affair, but I don't want to spend time talking about that because I think when I say betrayal, many of you are like, oh yeah, I already get that. I know I'm not going to have an affair. And you think like, I'm clear. I won't betray my wife, but I want to caution you against that thought pattern because that's not entirely true. The one that is probably not as obvious is watching pornography. Watching pornography really does your overall trust building capability. Now, when we talk about betrayal, one of the most obvious things is going to be an affair. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that because I think there are 3 other areas that you may not identify as a betrayal. And I want to help unpack those because those are probably the things that are more of a culprit in relationships where an affair is not even on the table or you're not doing it, because I don't want you to think like, oh, since I am not having an affair, this segment must not be for me. I'm good. My tent's up. Let's go. So the first one is watching pornography. The second one, spending money in secret. And the third one, talking poorly about your wife behind her back or in front of her, big or small things. It doesn't matter. So the three things: watching porn, spending money in secret, and I mean like large amounts of money. I'm not saying like if you spent $50 to buy a pair of shoes or something, unless of course that's identified as a large sum of money in your budget. And then number three, talking poorly about your wife in front of her or behind her back on big or small things. So let's briefly talk about why pornography is one of these areas of betrayal. This is a really hard one for most men, and I get it. Our eyes can get to the better of us, and we explore a very toxic environment that destroys our sexual drive towards our wife. And that's why this is a betrayal. When we explore the sexual drive of lusting after another woman on a video because that woman is doing something, remember, these are actresses. They're pretending. They're playing a role, okay? It's not real. It's not reality. And that's the problem, along with the lust that is also associated with it. Our minds, we start to tell ourselves like, oh yeah, our wife should be doing what I see on these videos. And our wife may not even have that level of sexual drive or wants to explore that type of sexuality, all right? Maybe whatever is working for the two of you in the bedroom, that's something that you guys got to kind of talk over and figure out what is appropriate for your sex life. I don't want to turn this whole podcast into this, so I'm just going to go through my notes. And if you got questions about this, then send me an email, husbandcoach2020@gmail.com. All right. We build unrealistic expectations. I already talked about that. These expectations create this loop in our mind that if she does not perform what we want, then she is no good at the thing. So we go elsewhere to get that need, i.e. the pornography, a need that should be exclusive between the two of you and your wife. Even though this is not an affair in person, the desire of looking at another woman in the way you should only hold your wife is an act of betrayal. It's that simple. I don't feel like I need to say anything more. The thing that you're supposed to hold sacred and be exclusive between you and your wife, you are now sharing and degrading that experience by tainting it with something else that isn't even real. You're going for the counterfeit. You are intentionally going for the counterfeit as opposed to staying with your wife and going for the real thing. All right. Now, most men know this, which is why they watch this content in private. This is why they watch it in private. All right. Think about it like this. If you can't do it in front of your wife, and we'll talk about couples that watch porn together here in a second, but if you can't do whatever it is that you are seeing in these videos, whatever, in front of your wife, it's probably not something you ought to do. And many of us know, like, hey, this isn't something that we should be doing. So we find time to go sneak away and do the thing. And that is ultimately hurting us. And I want to help the men that listen to this podcast overcome that issue. And for the wives that are listening to this episode, I ask that you encourage your husbands to go seek guidance and help so that they can overcome this, but in a loving way. Don't do it like, oh, see, Chris is telling you that you got to go do this. Like, no, that's not a loving way. And you're not going to get the results that you're looking for. Don't shame your husband into seeking the help. Instead, encourage your husband into seeking that and make it specific to you guys building your relationship of why you're asking your husband to go seek help in this. Let's talk for a second about couples that watch porn together, because I know that in the past, I've talked to people about this and they're like, well, no, my wife watches it with me, so it's not a big deal. She knows I watch it because she's right there. And if you go back to my statement, if you are not willing to do the things that you do in secret in front of your wife, then it's probably a problem. And they'll say, well, I do this in front of my wife and everything's fine. Well, here's the deal. Eventually, you grow out of that. We go through seasons. The problem is men in general, men specifically, we get way more addicted easily than women. So if your wife says, you know what, I am done with this, I don't want to explore this anymore in our life, but you want to continue on. Now you just found yourself in the exact same situation that I was referring to a second ago, where you are watching it in secret or on your own, which then eventually will start to hurt your relationship in that relationship, because maybe this is something that your wife is like, hey, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to mess around like that anymore. So just keep that in mind. Make sure that you understand what's going on. But I would also say that if your wife is watching it with you at the time that this is, like right now, let's say you and your wife are consistently watching adult rated movies together, and, that's how you guys build your sexual intimacy. Well, aside from growing out, how much of that is actually fake and not true sexual engagement with your spouse, and more of a fantasy? Because eventually the fantasies, they all fade away, and then you're left with your wife. Is your wife the person that you're actually having sex with, or is it the fantasy that your wife brings? And that's why I wanted to make sure that I address that, because that will lead to a level of betrayal. Now, let's move on to spending money in secret, because this is a big deal, right? I know a lot of couples that have struggled with this, leading to tons and tons of arguments. I've helped many men that are having problems with this. I personally struggled with this, and now I'm open with the spending, and I know that I can go to my wife and say, hey, I want to go buy this really expensive thing, and then we can talk about it. Now, this isn't in my notes, but it's reality. The issue that I ran into when I was spending money in secret is I didn't want my wife to tell me no. I'm a grown man. I work for the money that I want to spend. But what I was doing when I did that is I wasn't bringing my wife in to the discussion. So she was concerned that I was spending too much money and that our family wouldn't be taken care of in the case of whatever came up. Now, I had a budget. She knew what the budget was. The money that I was spending was out of cash flow. Now, I'm not going to get into finance talk, but that essentially just means after all of the expenses are paid, it's the money that's available in order for you to do X, Y, Z. So when my wife seen me spending hundreds of dollars on things out of the cash, or just on things, she didn't realize where the money was coming from, because my wife doesn't necessarily manage the finances. That's what I do. I share it with her. She has access to everything. She knows what our budget is, and where all of our bills lie and things of that sort, and subscriptions that we've signed up for. There's no secret. However, my wife was afraid that I was spending money that she didn't understand where it was coming from. So that's why what I do now is I go to her and I say, hey, I want to spend $500 on this thing. Here's where it's coming from. And here's when it's going to be. If it's $500 in cash, then I'm paying it off. And she knows where that cash is coming from. But if it's $500 in credit, then it's like, hey, this is when it'll be paid off, and this is the card that I'm going to use. So she now has more confidence in my purchasing. And there's a level of freedom that when things show up at the door, that I don't have to hide and feel like a little kid that got caught. Like, oh man, she's going to see that I just spent $400 on a thing. Even more so, what was really cool through this, and I guess through me just telling her that I want to purchase things, is I found out that my wife really doesn't care about me purchasing things. I didn't have to hide that to begin with. She didn't care all that much. Now, there are some things that she calls astronaut helmets, and those are purchases that I make that she doesn't see any value in, because it's as useless as an astronaut helmet for me, since I'm not an astronaut, right? Or it's a thing that I would use once in a blue moon, but I'm not using it regularly, which is fine, and I understand that. So it's helped our relationship, built our trust when it comes to spending money. Let me get back to the notes, because that was just me kind of sharing a testimony of why you want to stop spending in secret. So if you got any value out of that, then hit that like button, thumbs up, rate, subscribe, follow, all that good stuff. So money is often quoted as the number one reason for divorce. When you break this issue down to its core, it really is about not having trust. And these are the areas that you don't have trust in, that you can provide for your family, that you can manage the money effectively, that you will eventually spend all the money and leave the family stranded. See, our wives need security in knowing that they're going to be taken care of, all right? Doesn't matter how much money your wife makes, doesn't matter how much money you make. They just need to know they're going to be taken care of. And if they don't feel that comfort and confidence that you are going to be able to provide that, then one of two things happens. They go find another man that will, or they start working and they start to do their own thing and they kind of shut you out. Those are usually the two things that happen. We could argue that the third thing could happen where the wife becomes submissive and doesn't do anything about it, but that doesn't build trust. That builds fear that it really goes back to that first aspect minus finding a different man, right? Which is she doesn't feel confident or comfortable that you're going to provide for her. So when she goes into this submissive state, she's going to kind of hide away from you, and that's going to impact your intimacy. Definitely be careful with that, all right? When you do anything in secret, it usually always comes out in the light anyway. Like I said, when stuff would show up at the door and my wife would see it, she'd be like, "What's that?" And then it's like, dang, she caught me. It's eventually got to come into the house and she's going to see the thing. It's just the way it is. The problem is it usually comes out at a time when you least want it to and is the most hurtful to your relationship. Now, I can only think of a handful of times where that's happened to me. That's still the reality, right? Now, wives, if your husband is going through a challenge where he is spending and purchasing things behind your back, or maybe you're doing it, because let's face it, in many relationships across the United States, at least, it's the wives that are spending a lot of the money and the husbands are more reserved, putting their money off to the side and sometimes even having secret bank accounts just to make sure that the wives don't overspend, because I've encountered that as well. So if you are the wife that's overspending and hurting the trust in your husband, that you even know how to manage your own pocketbook or checking, once upon a time you used to have to balance checkbooks and they don't teach that anymore. It's kind of a shame because that taught you responsibility of knowing how much money you were spending, and it made you look at the money that was going out of the account. I do a version of this personally, even in the digital age today with debit cards and stuff. But besides the point, learn how to spend effectively to build the trust in your relationship. Doesn't matter who's doing it. Both of you need to work together to figure out how to build that level of trust in the relationship. Now, a few days ago, I heard a story about a husband who took out 17 credit cards in his wife's name over the duration of their marriage. He recently passed away, and he maxed out all of those cards and never paid a dime to the balance and left essentially the dollar amount to his wife, and she had to cover it and pay.
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo Concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. An unlikely friendship begins in the Paramount Plus original movie Little Wing, starring Brooklyn Prince with Kelly Riley and Brian Cox. Reeling from her parents' divorce, Caitlin steals a valuable bird to save her home, but instead forms a bond with the owner, leading to a new outlook on life. Little Wing, now streaming exclusively on Paramount Plus. Head to ParamountPlus.com to try it free. Rated PG-13.
Pay for it all and do everything. And downside to that, or, obviously you can see the downside to that, but just imagine how that has impacted the vision or the way that she views her late husband or her dead husband, probably not liking him in any way, shape, or form anymore, or is very frustrated at a bare minimum and doesn't trust that she's going to be taken care of in his passing, because she's experiencing all of these problems with, I don't know what the dollar amount was for the debt, 17 cards that he took out in her name and maxed out. That's a problem, right? So husbands, don't do that. Husbands or wives, don't do that either. Just know that spending money behind your wife's back is not a good thing. Now, let's go to the final aspect of betrayal, because I'm getting behind here. So the final aspect of betrayal is talking poorly about your wife behind her back or in front of her. It doesn't matter how big or small it is. Here's the deal. I'm not going to go over my notes on this because I want to make back some time. Social media isn't the place for you to air your problems with your wife. Don't get on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok and complain about how your wife is not doing something. That is not going to build trust. It's going to make your wife feel that she is betrayed because she's being mocked in front of the entire world when you put it on the social media. And if you're one of those people that think like, oh, well, it's just my friends that'll see this. Well, guess what? Your friends have friends and those friends have friends. And the next thing you know, it's out there across the world and it's all because of you. It's your fault. You can't say, oh, well, why would you repost that or why would you share that? Well, why did you post it to begin with? Have responsibility for your actions. Don't talk poorly about your wife because it doesn't make her feel confident. Wives, for you, same thing. Don't talk poorly about your husband. In fact, it hurts the relationship more when the wife talks poorly about the husband because we thrive off of respect from our wives. When our wives respect us, we reciprocate in love, and that just continues in this cycle, and it helps us so much. However, when we feel disrespected, then we respond in unloving ways. So wives, please don't talk poorly about your husband behind his back or in front of him because it doesn't end well for anyone involved. And no need to post that on social media. I don't know why our time has come where we feel like social media is our counselor or our mentor or whatever. Social media is not the place where you broadcast all of those problems because people on social media are sharks, all right? They just are. They're out looking for the next meal or the next thing to feed off of so they can get likes and all those other things. And it's stupid. Don't do it. All right. That's all I'll say about that. So let's jump down to the next topic here. What are some ways we can build trust in our marriage? So now that we kind of understand the problem, betrayal, and how that is the arch nemesis, because we're really just going to talk about betrayal as the problem. If you can overcome betrayal, then you can really start to foster trust in your relationship. And that's what we want to do. So number one, in order to build trust in your marriage, you have to become self-aware in the areas that you are destroying trust in your marriage. That's the whole purpose of this podcast. Now that you've heard some of this, and if you gotten to this point, then I think you understand how to become more self-aware. We talked about those 8 steps that you kind of got to look out for, really 7. Number 2, be consistent in building your wife up and responding to her concerns. Now, this goes to that 8th thing that we got to look out for in building trust in our relationship, which is we have to be consistent. I talk about consistency in so many ways, so I'm not going to break that down any further here. But if you want to go further with consistency, then that's where the Patreon account is really going to help, because there's going to be so many ways, techniques, strategies, whatever, for you to get that consistency down pack. Keep that in mind. All right. Be as transparent and vulnerable with her as you can. Build on this over time, because you have to trust your wife too for this to work. That vulnerability aspect, I told you about going dancing with my wife. I don't dance. It's not my thing. Because I was vulnerable there, I know that gave her confidence that I was going to do things that makes her happy, that brings her joy. And that is starting to build a environment, like I talked about in the beginning of this episode, that starts to build that environment. And when you build an environment, is just a beautiful aspect of what you want in your marriage, guess what? You're going to grow your marriage to the end state that you want. However, when you don't build an environment, because things need environments to thrive. This is the reason when we were in grade school, we used to build habitats and why we had to explore them, because there are certain conditions that need to be met in order for a thing to survive and to thrive. The same thing is true in our marriage. If you are constantly feeding bad things into your marriage, guess what? It's not going to grow. It's going to be a bad thing. Know the difference. Know how to build that and build that environment well, so that way you guys can be successful. It's the point of this entire series, Marriage Success, is so you can be successful in your marriage, build that environment, and change the way you guys respond to one another. The next thing, to grow trust. Set boundaries in your relationship that neither of you will cross, and respect them. You got to set boundaries. Boundaries are good because that lets you know when you're stepping outside of that environment, or when you start to bring stuff into the environment that doesn't belong. Okay. My wife, or let me rephrase. Back in the day, my mom used to yell at me and be upset if I tracked mud into the house because she wanted a clean environment. Mud is the epitome of dirt. It is literally dirt. And that did not make my mom happy. When I tracked mud into the clean environment, she would respond to me and tell me that I had to clean it, and I would have repercussions. The same thing has to happen in our marriage. When we bring mud into our clean environment that is going to help us thrive and grow, then we have to attack it with prejudice to remove it and extinguish it. So that way we set that environment for success well. So that's the reason why you have to put up boundaries and then not cross them. And then the last thing, check in with your wife regularly to see if you have done anything to hurt the trust in your relationship. And wives, check in with your husband regularly to see if there's anything that you've done to hurt the relationship. This is extremely important because if you're not doing check-ins, it's like the plane that took off from LA trying to get to New York, but because it was a few degrees off, it ended up going to Florida. And that was just because it decided not to check its glide path. Set the environment, agree on what your environment is, and then say, okay, hey, are we still adhering to this environment? Is our trust still being built in this environment? And if the case to that is yes, then great. If it's no, then start working on it. Every day is a day to build your marriage. I did the whole episode talking about becoming 1% better every week. And in order to get better every week, you got to work every day. And then every day, you got to work every hour. That sounds tiring. It sounds exhausting. But the truth is, once you get the rhythm, the minutes take care of themselves, the hours take care of themselves, and then the days take care of themselves. And then before you know it, the weeks and the months, and you really start to build in your marriage. And this is the reason why I want you to find a way to love your wife every single day, because that's going to help you build your marriage. I'm not saying that you have to do this grand gesture. Sometimes the way that you love your wife is maybe nothing directly with her. Maybe it's something where you are working on yourself, like listening to this podcast and then applying some of this stuff, is finding a way to love your wife for today maybe, and then tomorrow do something else. We've been going for a little while, and I had a full outro kind of plan, but I'm not going to go over everything that's on the outro. Here's the deal. All right. I'm just going to summarize what trust is, which is the thing gives us fuel to continue building our relationship. We have to earn trust. It's not freely given. I didn't talk about that in this episode, but hey, it's not freely given. We got to earn it. We earn it through identifying those 7 things and then working on that 8th, which is building the confidence and trust in our relationship. Many of you are in the rebuilding phase, and I understand that because that's just usually where people find my content is I did something and now I'm trying to fix it and find solutions. Here's the solution. Take it one day at a time and stay committed and be consistent. Whatever you planned to do to overcome whatever that issue was and to rebuild the trust, you got to make a plan, stay committed, and be consistent. That's it. I don't know how long it's going to take. I'm not one of those people that's going to tell you like, oh yeah, this will just like fix itself in a short period of time, because the level of hurt is really identified to the level of trust. And if your wife doesn't have the vision of what it looks like to have that trust restored, it's going to take longer, because I don't know when she's going to get that vision. You have to cast that vision. You got to show her that you mean it. And the way that you show her is through that consistency of your commitment to rebuild the trust. That's just the way it goes. And then wives, same thing is for you, because when you destroy trust by disrespecting your husband, guess what? It's going to take him longer to regain his confidence that you are going to respect him. So it's almost easier to maintain the trust that you have than it is to lose it and then have to rebuild it, because rebuilding trust is exhausting and it's tiring. And this is where a lot of couples, they fail, they fall apart, and they say, you know what, I just don't have it in me, rebuild this trust, so I'm not going to even try. And then it ends in divorce. And I don't want that for anyone who listens to this content, because I am personally combating divorce. I'm at war with divorce and helping couples overcome that issue. Because I do believe that divorce is plaguing in the United States, at least, because I can't speak to other countries. It is a plague in the United States, and we need to find a way to build our marriages. So with that, I want you guys to go and talk about trust in your relationship. And for all my husbands, I want you to find a way to love your wife every day. Peace.